In the spring of 1935, in a farmhouse kitchen in the far western corner of the Oklahoma Panhandle, in that hard, flat country the old maps called No Man's Land, a woman stood at her kitchen table making biscuits with a wet dish towel draped over the mixing bowl, lifting one corner to pour in the milk, tucking it back down while she stirred, because the air in her own kitchen had dirt in it, a fine brown silt that sifted down from the ceiling and crept in around the window sashes, no matter how many flour paste rags she packed into the cracks. She had hung wet sheets over the windows that morning, the way she did whenever the northwest sky turned the color of an old bruise, and she had set the supper table the way every woman out on those plains had learned to set it. Plates turned face down, cups turned face down, the milk pitcher covered with a saucer, so that when her family sat down they could turn their dishes over at the very last second and eat off clean china in a dirty world. The dust had taken her garden that year, and the year before it had taken the wheat, and still, every single evening of that terrible decade, that woman put a hot supper on a clean plate and called her family in to eat it. You can see her, can't you? Maybe she has your grandmother's face. Maybe she has your mother's. Plenty of you watching lived this, or were raised by the people who did. Today we are going back to those kitchens together, to the Dust Bowl years, to Oklahoma and Kansas and the Texas Panhandle in the 1930s, and we are going to remember 25 meals that fed the families who stayed, meals that have all but vanished from American tables, meals made out of wheat nobody would buy, and weeds nobody had planted, and jars carried down into cellars dug by hand. And I am saving the sweetest memory of all for the very end, the one that was not really a supper at all, the one that smelled like caramel and sounded like children laughing while the wind howled outside and could not get in. So pull your chair up close to the stove, and if you love these little journeys back into the America that made us, do subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because here at Forgotten Flavors, we remember the flavors that time forgot. Now, before we lift the first lid, you have to understand what made the Dust Bowl kitchen different from every other hard times kitchen in America, because the Depression and the Dust Bowl were two different troubles, and out on the southern plains a family got both of them at once. The Depression took the money. The Dust Bowl came along behind it and took everything the money used to be unnecessary for. It took the garden, buried under drifts of blow dirt as high as the fence posts. It took the rain, year after year after year. It took the topsoil itself and carried it clear to the Atlantic Ocean on the wind. Some families lost the milk cow, and with her went the butter and the buttermilk, and half the recipes a plainswoman knew by heart. And here is the bitterest arithmetic of that whole bitter time. The wheat farmers of those plains were sitting on granaries full of wheat down around a quarter a bushel, wheat it hardly paid to haul to town. Hungry families, and food on every side that could not be turned into money. So the Plains kitchen learned to run on what was actually there. It ran on wheat and lard and sorghum, on weeds and rabbits and green tomatoes, on government flour and neighborly mercy, and it ran with the table set proper and grace said over every plate, because a duster could take a woman's garden, but it could not make her quit acting like a lady in her own house. Nobody out there called it poverty either. They called it dry years. They said next year, it will rain next year, this is next year country, and while they waited on next year, they cooked. So let's begin, and let's remember them properly, the way they deserve. Let's start with the breakfast that came straight out of the granary: boiled wheat, wheatberry porridge, the crop itself served in a bowl. It sounds almost too plain to mention, and that is exactly why nobody wrote it down. Farm families looked at those full bins and did the only sensible thing left. They ate it. Mother sent a child out with a lard pail to dip wheat from the bin, and she winnowed the chaff off it and picked it over on the tabletop and set it to soak overnight in the big kettle. Come morning, it simmered long and slow, until every little berry swelled up plump and burst its jacket, and what you got was a pot full of chewy, nutty, honest porridge that stuck to a child's ribs clear till the noon bell. Milk over it if the cow was giving, a spoonful of sorghum or brown sugar if the bucket allowed, and there was breakfast for 8 people, grown on your own land, threshed by your own hands, costing not 1 cent of cash money. Some women ran the wheat through the coffee grinder first, so it cooked quicker, and cracked wheat cooked up creamier, and the children ate it every morning of the dry years, and here is the funny thing, most of them remembered it kindly. Warm, sweet, filling, what is there for a child to resent? It was the fathers who could not always look at it, because a man eats his own unsold crop with a different heart than a 7-year-old does. When the rains came back and the prices came back, boiled wheat left the American table so completely that most families never spoke of it again. But the next one poured comfort over bread on the mornings when even the wheat pot felt like too much to ask. Gravy bread. On more mornings than anybody counted, breakfast was a pan of hot gravy ladled over yesterday's bread, and that was the whole meal, and children climbed down from the table full. Mother put a spoonful of bacon drippings or lard in the black skillet, shook in flour, and stirred it brown, and that little wrist motion, that steady figure 8 with a fork, is a thing some of you can still see your own mothers doing if you close your eyes. Then the milk went in slow, and the gravy bubbled and thickened, and salt and plenty of black pepper, and it went over torn pieces of bread in the bowls, peppery and warm all the way down. And on the places where the cow had gone dry, or gone altogether, Mother made it with water gravy, and seasoned it a little harder and said nothing, and the children ate it just the same. Think about what that skillet was doing. Flour was cheap or free from the relief. Drippings were saved from every scrap of pork that ever crossed the stove, and 5 minutes of a tired woman's attention turned them into something hot and rich enough to send men to the field and children to school with their stomachs quiet. Gravy was the great multiplier of the Plains kitchen, the trick that made bread into a meal. Ask anyone raised in those years what they miss, and watch how many of them, before they name anything fancy, get quiet and say, "My mother's gravy." Nobody makes it for breakfast anymore, not on a Tuesday, not over torn bread in a farmhouse bowl, but the next one came off the same griddle-wearing lace on its edges, and it carried the sweetest word in the whole Dust Bowl vocabulary: sorghum. Fried mush cakes with sorghum syrup. Cornmeal stirred into a simple batter, salt, a little soda, buttermilk or water, and fried thin in a screaming hot skillet, wiped with a pork rind, so that every little cake came out with crisp brown lace around its edges and a soft steaming middle. Stacked 3 high on a plate, a shave of butter if there was butter, and then, over the top, a slow amber ribbon of sorghum, what the old folks called long sweetening. Sugar was cash money, but sorghum cane a family could grow themselves in the driest years, because sorghum stood up to drought better than nearly anything alive. Come fall, the cane went to the neighborhood sorghum mill, where a mule walked circles turning the press, and the green juice boiled down in long shallow pans, and somebody skimmed the foam, and the children stood around that sweet-smelling steam, like moths around a lamp, waiting to lick the skimmer. A family hauled home its winter sweetening in gallon buckets, and those buckets rode to school later as lunch pails, and that is as close to a perfect economy as this country ever ran. Mush cakes with sorghum was Saturday supper and Sunday breakfast, and the answer to the last 3 days before the relief flour came. Crisp, hot, sweet, and made entirely of things no banker could repossess. The cakes faded when boxed pancake mix got cheap, and the sorghum mills went quiet one by one, and now most Americans have never once tasted long sweetening. But the next one filled the coffee cups when the coffee can was down to memories, and it started with a root. Chicory. When times were flush, the coffee out on the plains came from the store in bright paper packages, and the smell of it was the smell of morning itself. But coffee was cash, and cash was gone, so the plains did what hard-up country people have done for 200 years. They stretched it, and then they replaced it. Chicory root, dug or bought by the sack, roasted dark and ground fine, went into the pot, alongside the last real coffee, half and half, then 3 parts to 1, and finally all by itself, boiled up strong, with the eggshells thrown in to settle the grounds the way grandmother swore by. And when even chicory was dear, women parched barley in the oven, or wheat bran, stirred dark and bitter and hot, and poured it out with a straight face and called it coffee, and the men drank it and called it coffee too, because at 5:30 on a winter morning, hot and brown counts for a great deal. Children got their own version, a splash of the brew in a cup of hot milk with sugar, and they felt grown drinking it. Now folks in Louisiana will tell you chicory coffee never went anywhere down there, and bless them, they are right. But on the plains it was strictly a hard times drink, and the day a family could buy real coffee again was a day people actually remembered all their lives, the way you remember a holiday. But the next brew came from a root the Dust Bowl families did not even have to buy, because it was growing in the yard, free, all along. Dandelion coffee. Now, we have talked before on this channel about eating the dandelion's greens in the spring. Out on the dry plains, folks went one step further, clear down to the root. After a rain, when the ground gave a little, the children were sent out with a butcher knife and a bucket to pry up dandelions whole, and the long, pale taproots got scrubbed at the pump, chopped, dried on the warming shelf, and then roasted slow in the oven till they were brown clear through, and the whole kitchen smelled toasty and dark, a smell all its own. Ground fine in the coffee mill, brewed like the real thing, it made a cup that was deep and roasty and just pleasantly bitter, and there is no jitter in it at all, so even the children could have a cup at supper, and did, with cream and sugar, proud as senators. A weed, the most cussed and hoed-at weed in America, and a plains mother saw breakfast in the leaves, coffee in the root, and let the bees have the flowers. That is not poverty thinking, that is genius wearing an apron. Dandelion coffee disappeared the minute the store kind came back within reach, because it was work. And nowadays you can walk into a fancy health store and buy roasted dandelion root at a price that would have made those mothers sit down and fan themselves. But the next 3 all traveled in a syrup bucket with a wire handle and a schoolchild attached to it, and the first of them was the plainest lunch a child in this country ever carried. The lard sandwich, 2 slices of bread, home-baked, spread with clean white home-rendered lard, a sprinkle of salt, a grind of pepper, if the house believed in pepper, wrapped in waxed paper, and packed into a syrup pail alongside a boiled egg on the good weeks. That was dinner, which is what they called the noon meal, for tens of thousands of plains school children through the dry years. Let me say what the old folks would want said. Good lard from your own hogs, on good bread your mother baked at 4 in the morning, with salt, is not a sad meal. It is bread and butter for people whose butter had to be sold. Cream and butter and eggs were the cash a farm had left, so the family sold the butter and ate the lard, and that one swap tells you nearly everything about how those years worked. If it had been a butchering week, there might be cracklings worked into the lard, crisp little salty bits, and a cracklin' sandwich was something a child could feel rich about. And here is the detail that gets me every time. The children did not hide those sandwiches. Everybody's pail held about the same, and eating was eating, and shame is a thing children mostly have to be taught. Many a grown man in the 1970s would still now and then stand at his own kitchen counter late at night and salt a piece of buttered bread, and if you had asked him why, he would have had to think a minute. But the next sandwich in the pail was the one the children actually prayed for, because it glittered. The sugar sandwich. Bread, butter if the week allowed, or lard if it did not, and a spoonful of white sugar sprinkled edge to edge, pressed down so the sugar would stay put. That was it. That was the treasure. A child who opened the syrup bucket at noon and found a sugar sandwich knew that somebody at home was thinking about them at 4 that morning. Sugar was real money, remember, rationed by the family purse, kept in a canister that mother alone commanded, measured into the coffee and the canning, and almost nowhere else. So a sugar sandwich was not a snack, it was a message. It said, "This day is special," or "You have been good help," or "I know the wind has been blowing for a week, and everyone's nerves are worn through. Here, something sweet." On the finest days there was cinnamon dusted over the sugar, and a cinnamon sugar sandwich with the butter starting to soak up into the crumb, eaten in a schoolyard out of the wind, is a memory some of you are tasting right now as I say it. City folks had their nickel candy counters. The Plains child had bread and sugar, and did not feel one bit cheated. It vanished, of course. Sugar got cheap, and sweets got everywhere, and a sandwich made of sugar stopped meaning anything. That is the strange, sad rule running under this whole hour, friends. Plenty is a wonderful thing, but it is very hard on meaning. But the third sandwich in the pail belonged mostly to the fathers, and it bit back. The onion sandwich. A thick slice of onion, cut the full width of the loaf, laid between 2 slices of buttered or lard spread bread with a good pinch of salt, and pressed flat. That was a working man's dinner in the field, that was supper on the lean nights, and that, friends, was reckoned by many a plainsman to be not hardship, but pleasure. Onions were the reliable crop of the dry years. They asked little water, they kept all winter in the cellar, and a family with a sack of onions and a barrel of flour was a family with options. The men ate onion sandwiches seriously, a big raw slice, sweet and hot at the same time, and they washed it down with well water or cold chicory and went back to work, and you could tell where a crew had eaten by the smell, and nobody minded, because everybody matched. Children ate them toasted on the stovetop till the onion went soft and sweet, and there was a wisdom under it, because the old people held that onions kept sickness off, and they ate them against colds and dust and worry alike, and whether the doctors would sign that or not, the believing itself did a body good. The onion sandwich survived in the lunchboxes of railroad men and farmers well into the 50s, and then breath got fashionable, and the onion sandwich went the way of the spittoon. But before we open the next pail, I have to stop and tell you about one particular Sunday, because you cannot understand a single dish from these years until you have stood inside that afternoon. April the 14th, 1935, Palm Sunday. It came up soft and clear and still, the first truly kind day in weeks, and all across the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas and up through Kansas, people did what starved for sunshine people do. They went to church and lingered afterward. They drove out to visit kin, aired the bedding, and let the children play outside with their coats off. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, the birds went strange. They came flying low and hard out of the north, in ragged, panicked strings, every kind of bird together, and behind them the horizon itself stood up. A black wall, rolling and boiling like smoke off the biggest fire in the world, but cold and silent until it was nearly on you. They called it Black Sunday, and the duster that hit that afternoon turned day to night in the time it takes to read a psalm. People caught driving, sat blind in their cars, with the headlamps swallowed whole. People caught walking crawled along fence lines, hand over hand, to houses they could not see. And inside the houses, the women lit the lamps at 4 in the afternoon, wet fresh sheets and hung them, set the wet cloths over the baby's crib, and gathered everybody in one room to wait it out. Here is the part I need you to hear. When it passed, and the world came back gray and strange, with drifts like brown snow against every fence, those women shoveled the dirt out of their kitchens, washed every dish in the house, wiped the table twice, and put supper on it. That same night. Whatever this hour is really about, friends, it is about that. But now, back to the food, because when the dust took the gardens, the plains women turned around and harvested the one crop the wind itself had planted. Tumbleweeds and lamb's quarters. I am going to say that again slowly, because it is one of the most remarkable sentences in American cooking. During the dust years, families on the southern plains ate tumbleweeds and were glad to have them. The tumbleweed, the Russian thistle, was about the only green thing that could still grow when the sky forgot how to rain, and the secret was to catch it young, in its first tender weeks, before the spines harden, when the shoots are soft and green, and boiled up with a little bacon grease and a splash of vinegar. They made a dish of greens, close enough to spinach that hungry children did not argue. Women canned them, friends. Quart on quart of tumbleweed greens went down cellar, put up in salt brine against the winter, and in some kitchens, that green row of jars was the difference between a thin table and a bare one. And alongside the thistle grew lamb's quarters, wild spinach the old folks called it, coming up free and uninvited in every failed field and fence corner, cooking up sweeter and richer than store spinach ever dreamed of. Children went out with dishpans and stripped the tender tops, and mother washed them in 3 waters and wilted them down with grease and salt, and that was the green on the plate, all spring, all summer, free. Nobody plants lamb's quarters today, and everybody poisons the thistle, and I understand, but hear this. The land those families thought had turned against them was still trying to feed them, and they still knew how to let it. But the next wild supper hung in pods along the fence rows, and it needed a grandmother's eye to gather safely. Milkweed. Along the draws and the fence lines where the plow had never reached and the dust had not drifted deep, the common milkweed went right on about its business through the whole disaster, and the families who had grandmothers raised in the old wild ways knew there were meals hanging on it. In early summer came the pods, and you wanted them young, no longer than your thumb, firm and green, the silk inside still soft, boiled in a change or two of water, then finished with butter or bacon grease and salt. They came out tender and mild, somewhere between green beans and okra, and a plate of buttered milkweed pods with cornbread was supper in many a house. In spring, some families took the young shoots and cooked them like asparagus, and there were women who dipped the little pods in batter when there was an egg to spare and fried them crisp, and the children ate those like candy. Now, foraging was not a game, and the grandmothers ran it like a schoolroom. Which plant, which month, which size, boiled how, the knowing was exact, handed down hand to hand at the fence-row, and a child walked beside that knowledge and learned it the way children learn everything that matters, by being trusted with it. That schoolroom is closed now, and that is the truest way to say this dish vanished. The milkweed still stands along a million fence lines, feeding the butterflies, and hardly one American in 1,000 knows their great-grandmother could have fed them from it too. But the next one came out of the garden after all, the year's whole garden, picked green on one desperate afternoon. Green tomato everything. Here is a scene that played out 10,000 times across the plains in those years. A garden, watered by hand all summer with wash water and dishwater hauled bucket by bucket, finally hangs heavy with tomatoes, every one of them green, and the radio says a norther is coming, a freeze, or worse, a duster big enough to sandblast the vines bare. And so the whole family turns out in the cold-smelling dusk and strips every tomato off every vine, wash tubs of them, and hauls them into the kitchen. And then the woman of the house does what plains women did with everything: she refuses to lose. The firmest ones get wrapped in newspaper and laid in shallow boxes under the beds to ripen slowly clear into December. The rest get transformed. Thick green slices dredged in cornmeal and fried in drippings till the crust crackles and the inside goes soft and tangy. Fried green tomatoes, supper that very night. Kettles of green tomato relish, chow chow, chopped fine with onions and vinegar and whatever sugar could be spared, sealed in jars to sit bright on the shelf and wake up a whole winter of plain suppers. Green tomato pie, sliced thin with sugar and cinnamon and a splash of vinegar, it bakes up so close to apple pie that men at church suppers praised the apples. And green tomato mincemeat, spiced dark and rich, ready to become Christmas pies in a house where Christmas needed all the help it could get. An entire cuisine, friends, built overnight out of a frost warning. But the next one grew wild in the creek bottoms, and picking it was the closest thing those hard summers had to a holiday. Sand plums. Out in that country, the draws and creek banks were laced with wild plum thickets, sand plums, Chickasaw plums, low scrubby tangles that bloomed white and sweet-smelling every April, sometimes the only soft thing in 100 miles of brown, and the sight of plum blossom in a dust year felt like a promise somebody finally intended to keep. Come July, the thickets hung full of little plums, red and orange and gold, tart as a scolding, and whole families went after them together, buckets and lard pails, the children eating one for every 3 they picked, and coming home stained to the elbows, itching with chiggers, and gloriously happy. And then the kitchen turned into a jelly works. The plums boiled up, the juice dripped through a flour sack bag overnight, and no thrifty woman ever squeezed the bag, because squeezing clouds the jelly, and her jelly was going to glow like a church window, or she would know the reason why. Sugar and juice and the rolling boil, the saucer test on the windowsill, and then the row of jars, that impossible red gold. Sand plum jelly on hot biscuits was breakfast glory. A jar of it was a gift, fit for the teacher, the preacher, the sick neighbor. In a country with no money, that jelly was currency, minted in July, spent all winter. The thickets are still out there, fewer every year, bulldozed for center pivots and clean fences. The jelly, when you find it now at a farm stand, costs like perfume, and it should. But the next jelly was made from something most farms burned in the cook stove, and I promise you every word of it is true. Corn cob jelly. When a Plains family shelled its corn, the cobs did not go to waste. Nothing went to waste. The cobs kindled the stove and smoked the meat. But somewhere back down the line, some woman, and I would give a good deal to know her name, discovered that if you boiled a dozen clean red corn cobs hard for half an hour, the water they left behind ran a pretty amber pink and tasted, of all the things in this world, faintly of apples. Strain that liquor through a flour sack, add sugar, and bring it to the boil, and it sets up into a clear rosy jelly that folks who did not know better swore was apple, and folks who did know better spread thicker. Corn cob jelly, friends. Jelly from the part of the harvest that even the hogs were done with. It went on to biscuits and cornbread, and it cost exactly the price of the sugar. A woman who could set a jar of that on her table was making an announcement no duster could argue with. This family is not beaten. We can make dessert out of firewood. There were counties where corncob jelly took ribbons at the fair, and the judges knew exactly what they were honoring, and it was not just the flavor. It slipped away with the shelled corn farm itself, and today it survives as a curiosity at heritage festivals, made by ladies keeping faith with their grandmothers. But the next spread was richer, and it came together in a skillet out of eggs and long sweetening on the lucky mornings when the hens were generous. Egg butter. This one came up onto the plains with the families out of the Ozarks and the upland south, and if your people are from that stock, You may be one of the last Americans alive who has tasted it. Egg butter had no butter in it at all, and that was the whole idea. You poured a good cup of sorghum molasses into the iron skillet and let it come to a simmer. You beat 2 or 3 eggs in a bowl, and then, slow and easy, you streamed the eggs into that hot sorghum and kept it moving over a gentle fire until the whole business thickened into something between a custard and a preserve, glossy, brown gold, flecked through, with a grate of nutmeg over the top in the houses that owned a nutmeg. And that, spread warm on hot split biscuits, was egg butter, and men have gone misty at the memory of it 80 years after the fact. Taste it in your mind for a second. Deep, dark cane sweetness, rich egg silkiness, warm spice, on a biscuit with steam still coming off it, on a morning cold enough to frost the nail heads on the north wall. It was Sunday breakfast and company breakfast, made when the hens were laying and the sorghum bucket still swung heavy, and it vanished the way only homely things vanish. No restaurant ever served it, no company ever boxed it. It lived in the wrist of the woman stirring it, and it went where she went. If your grandmother made egg butter, friend, I hope you wrote something down. But the next one was not a dish at all. It was a possession, a treasure kept on a nail by the stove, and it seasoned half the food in this story. The salt pork rind. In the Dust Bowl kitchen, meat was mostly a verb, something done to other food, and the tool that did it was salt pork, and the very last inch of the salt pork, the tough leathery rind, worked longer hours than any ingredient in America. Understand, when a family butchered, or when the relief allotted its slab of white side meat, every layer had its calling. The lean streaks went to the beans, the fat rendered into lard, and the rind became equipment. It hung on a nail by the stove, and before every batch of mush cakes or cornbread, Mother rubbed it over the hot griddle, one quick pass, just enough grease and salt and pork sole to keep things from sticking and make them taste like more than they were. It rode along in the bean pot, giving up its strength through a long simmer, and then it was fished out and saved, because it had 2 or 3 more pots left in it. It flavored the greens and the milkweed pods and the black-eyed peas, working like a stone in stone soup, except the stone was pork and the soup was a decade. And when at long last it had given everything, it still was not done, because it went to whichever child had been best that day, to chew like salty leather candy, and there are folks in their 90s who can tell you exactly what they did to earn it. One piece of rind, weeks of flavor, a lesson in stewardship you could hold in your hand, but the next dish belonged to the houses that had managed to keep their cow, and on churning day, it turned the leavings into supper. Buttermilk soup. On the farms where the milk cow made it through, and keeping her fed through those years was a saga all by itself, churning day left the crock full of real buttermilk, tangy, flecked with little freckles of butter, and the thrifty families of German and Scandinavian stock who had settled those plains knew better than to drink it all plain. They cooked it, hot buttermilk soup. The buttermilk went into the pot to warm gently, a paste of flour worked smooth so it would not curdle, stirred and careful, and the soup thickened into something creamy with a bright clean tang, and then each house declared its faith. The sweet households finished it with sugar and a stick of cinnamon and maybe a handful of raisins gone plump in the simmering, and served it over cubes of dry bread, practically a dessert. The plain households kept it savory, with salt and a good deal of pepper, and ate it with cornbread, and both were right. It was Monday night food, wash day food, food for the evening after the butter was molded, cheap as the leavings it was made from, warm as a shawl, and gone, so completely gone that most Americans have never once heard its name. It went where the home churn went. Now, friends, before we go on, I want to talk about rabbits, and I want to do it honestly, because no telling of the Dust Bowl table is truthful without them. And there are two suppers to remember here, and the first one simmered in nearly every farmhouse on the plains. Prairie hare stew. Rabbit was the meat of the dry years. When the hogs had been sold, and the steers had been sold or lost, the country itself still ran with cottontails and jackrabbits, and a boy with a single-shot .22 and strict instructions about wasting shells became a serious contributor to the family economy. Cottontail was the tender prize, but the big lanky jackrabbit, the one folks took to calling the Hoover hog, with that dry plains humor that grinned so it would not have to groan, Jack was what there was more of, and a smart cook knew his ways. The meat soaked overnight in salt water, then into the pot he went with an onion, and he simmered, patient, most of an afternoon, because a jackrabbit has spent his whole life running, and it shows, and only time and a low fire can talk him out of it. Then the potatoes, the carrots if the cellar offered any, a thickening of flour shaken in a jar of water, salt and pepper, and by supper time the pot had turned all that lean wild muscle into a brown, steaming, honest stew, ladled over biscuits or cornbread, with nobody at the table feeling sorry for themselves in the least. Fried rabbit for Sunday if the rabbits were young, stew for everything else, and mothers who could no more have bought beef than bought Paris served that stew with their heads up. It carried whole families across whole winters. But the second rabbit supper has a harder story wrapped around it, and I am going to tell it to you straight, because the people who lived it deserve the truth told kindly. Jackrabbit and dumplings. In the worst of the dry years, the jackrabbits multiplied past all sense, and they came into what pitiful crops and gardens were left, and ate them to the dirt, and a family watching its last green feed disappear into a sea of rabbits was a family watching its cows starve by proxy. So the communities organized what they called rabbit drives. On a Sunday afternoon, whole townships turned out, men and boys in a great line miles wide, walking, hollering, driving the rabbits before them into a fenced pen, and there they were clubbed. I will not pretty it up. It was a grim business, and plenty of the men hated it, and some of the women would not speak of it, and it was also the vegetable patch, or the rabbits, and hungry people do not get to vote on easier questions. What I want you to see is what happened after. The wagons went home loaded, and nothing was wasted, and for weeks, the kitchens of the county turned rabbit into every dish a chicken ever starred in, and the crown of them all was jackrabbit and dumplings. The long-simmered meat pulled from the bone, the broth golden and deep, and then the dumplings, rolled thin and cut in strips or dropped soft from a spoon, drinking up that broth, stretching one lean animal across a table of 8. Children who were not told assumed it was chicken. Children who were told mostly did not care. Jars of canned rabbit went down cellar beside the tumbleweed greens, and neighbors got quarts left on their porches without a word said. When the rains finally came back, the plains put that dish down and never once looked over their shoulder at it, and who on this earth could blame them? But before we come up out of these hardest memories, we need to spend a minute on the leaving, because not everybody stayed, and the food of those years fed the goodbyes too. They left by the tens of thousands, 250,000 and more off the southern plains before it was over, the tired and the dusted out and the foreclosed, headed west down Route 66, with the mattress roped on top, and the skillet packed last so it could be found first, and the leaving had its own table. When a family sold out, the neighbors came to the farm sale whether they had money or not, and the women brought food the way women bring food to a funeral, because it partly was one, fried chicken from somebody's precious flock, wash tubs of beans, pies from the cellar's last shelf, and the departing family ate, surrounded one last time by everyone who knew their name, and the men shook hands too long, and the women wrapped the leftover pie in a dish towel and put it in the truck cab, and the dish towel was a gift too, and everybody understood that. And for the ones who stayed, the church supper became something very near to a survival system, and the pie supper was its own Plains institution, the box social, where the young women packed suppers in decorated boxes, and the young men bid on them, and the bidding was for the school's coal fund or the teacher's salary, and a boy would bid 2 weeks of trapping money to eat fried pies beside the right girl, and the whole crowded lamplit schoolhouse laughed and forgot the wind. Community, friends. That was the ingredient that does not show up in any recipe in this hour, and it was in every single one of them. But now we have to meet the truck that came from the government, because for many families in the worst stretch, that truck was the margin, and out of it came a food remembered with real affection. Government commodities, and above all, the cheese. When the relief programs finally reached the Plains counties, they came partly as work and partly as food, and the food came in plain sacks and plain cans off the back of a truck. Flour, dried beans, salt pork, sometimes canned beef from the great cattle buyout. The whole tragedy looped back on itself into supper. And then there was the cheese. It came in long loaves, deep yellow, and whatever the paperwork called it, everybody else called it commodity cheese. And here is the scandal of memory, friends. It was good. It sliced clean. It melted like a dream. And the women of the Plains, who could stretch anything, stretched it into glory. Macaroni and commodity cheese, baked till the top browned, was the star, a supper children asked for out loud. Cheese melted over relief flour biscuits. Cheese grated into the morning mush cakes. A slice of that cheese on a slice of onion between bread turned 3 humble stories from this hour into one royal sandwich. Some families sent a child to stand in the line because the fathers could not make their legs do it, and I ask you to be gentle with that memory. Pride was half of what some of those men had left. But nobody's pride argued with the supper itself. Decades on, their grown children would taste some fine imported cheddar and shake their heads and say it. That government cheese was better, and they were not wrong. They were remembering the relief in it. But the next dish took the week's stale biscuits and turned them into Sunday, and it deserves to come back. Biscuit pudding. In a house where biscuits got baked every single morning, there were always a few gone hard by Saturday, and throwing them out was not an idea that existed. So into a baking dish they went, broken up rough, and over them a custard of milk, an egg or two, sugar, a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg, vanilla in the households that kept a bottle, and the whole thing stood a while so the biscuits could drink, then baked slow until the top crusted golden and the inside set soft as a feather bed. Biscuit pudding, bread pudding's country cousin, and some would tell you the richer relation, because a buttermilk biscuit soaks up custard the way plain bread only wishes it could, raisins scattered through it on the flush weeks. And over the top, in the houses that really loved you, a simple hot sauce of butter, sugar, and water boiled together with a splash of vanilla, poured on at the table so it ran down into every crevice, steaming. That was Sunday dessert through years, when dessert had no business existing at all, made entirely of things already paid for, and it turned the week's leftovers into the week's celebration, which, if you have been listening close, is the whole Dust Bowl kitchen in a single dish. It faded when biscuits stopped being daily bread, because you cannot make biscuit pudding without yesterday's biscuits, and America stopped having yesterdays like that. But the next dessert is the most famous fooler in American history, a pie whose apples were never apples at all. Mock apple pie. Long before any cracker company printed a version on its box and took the bow, Plains and Prairie mothers were performing this particular miracle with plain soda crackers out of the barrel. Because here was the problem. Apples cost money, apples came from off the place, and a duster does not care how long you have waited for pie. And here was the discovery. common crackers, broken up in a pie shell, drenched with a boiled syrup of sugar and water sharpened with cream of tartar or vinegar or a little lemon flavoring, cinnamon over all, dotted with whatever butter could be spared, lidded with crust and baked. Come out of that oven soft, layered, tart-sweet, and spiced in a way that walks and talks so much like apple pie that grown men at threshing tables were fooled outright, and testified so. The crackers turn tender, the syrup turns to filling, the cinnamon does what cinnamon does, and the tongue believes what the heart needs it to. Now some will ask, why pretend at all? Why not just make a sugar pie and call it honest? And that question misses the whole point, friends. The pretending was the gift. A mother who set a fake apple pie in front of her family in the middle of a ruined year was not lying to anybody. She was declaring that this family would have apple pie in October, dust or no dust, dollars or no dollars, and the crackers were simply drafted into the cause. But the next pie did not even pretend. It looked winter in the eye and got its pucker from the vinegar jug itself. Vinegar pie. The old ones called pies like this Desperation pies, though never at the table, and vinegar pie was their queen. Out on the plains, lemons were nearly a rumor, something that rode in on a train for people with railroad money. But every farmhouse on earth had a vinegar jug, and some woman generations back had figured out the secret those lemons were hiding, which is that a pie mostly needs sweetness with an argument in it. So, a custard of sugar, a little flour, an egg or two, water, a knob of butter, and a few careful spoonfuls of cider vinegar poured into a crust and baked gentle till it just barely shivered. And what came out, friends, was not a joke and not a substitute. It was a bright, tangy, butterscotch-edged custard pie that had strangers at church suppers asking what lemon recipe that was, and plainswomen learned to just smile, because half the pleasure of a vinegar pie was watching somebody fail to detect it. It cost pennies, it used nothing the household did not already hold, and it put genuine dessert, real shine, on tables that the whole rest of the world had written off. Food historians today will tell you a good vinegar pie stands beside any lemon chess pie, and there are a few old cafes that have brought it back at $7 a slice, which would have made the original bakers laugh till they cried. But the next pie went one step further down and one step higher up, because it was made, and I mean this literally, mostly of water. Water pie. When the cupboard got down to flour, sugar, a little butter, and faith, a plains mother could still make dessert, and this was it, and I want you to hear the recipe in full. Into an unbaked pie shell, pour a cup and a half of plain water. Sprinkle over it, gently, a mix of sugar and flour. Dot it with butter. Add a splash of vanilla if the bottle held any, and slide it, water sloshing, into the oven, and bake it long and low, and do not open that door, and somewhere in that patient hour, a little miracle happens. The flour and sugar and butter and water stop being themselves and become a single silky caramel-tasting custard, set soft, golden on top, and a slice of it, warm, tastes like somebody made you a promise and kept it. Water pie, friends. Dessert conjured out of the well and the flour barrel. The children never knew. That is the part that gets me. You will hear folks say it in their old age. We never knew we were poor. And water pie is exactly how they never knew. It was baked on the very bottom days and served with the same flourish as Christmas and eaten to crumbs, and if the making of it ever cost those mothers something in the privacy of their own hearts, they did not bill the children for it. It disappeared so completely that when it resurfaced a few years back, whole generations refused to believe it was real. But the next chapter is not one dish, it is the room that held every jar in this whole story, dug by hand into the plains themselves. The cellar. Every one of these meals we have remembered today had the same address, friends, down 8 dirt steps behind the house, under a slanted wooden door. On the southern plains, the cellar was two salvations in one. It was the storm cave, the Frady hole, where families huddled with a kerosene lamp while the tornadoes and the black dusters passed over. And it was the pantry, the vault, the family bank in a decade when actual banks had shown what they were worth. Because down there, cool and dark, stood the shelves, and on the shelves stood the year's work in glass. The tumbleweed greens and the green tomato relish, the sand plum jelly and the corncob jelly glowing like lamplight, the canned rabbit, and, on the sorrowful years, canned beef, because when the government bought the doomed cattle, families could keep and can what was fit of their own, and a woman stood at her stove in August and put her own herd into quart jars and said nothing about it, ever. County agents and home demonstration ladies crossed those plains, teaching pressure canning to anyone with a kettle, and by the end of it, plains women could can absolutely anything that stood still. And on the deep winter nights, a mother would take the lamp and go down those steps and stand a minute, just looking, before she chose the supper jars. Nobody who has not been hungry can fully read the ledger she was reading, row on row of proof that the dust had done everything the dust could do, and her family was going to eat until spring anyway. That cellar was the victory, friends, the whole quiet war won in quart jars. And if these old kitchens have stirred a memory in you tonight, I hope you will subscribe and keep remembering with us, because this table always has room for one more chair. But now the lamp is lit upstairs, and the last memory is waiting, the one I promised you, and it begins with a pot of sorghum coming to a boil after supper. Taffy night. On some winter evening, with the wind hunting around the eaves and the dust sifting at the sills, when the children's nerves had been sanded thin by one gray day too many, a plains mother would look around the kitchen and say the blessed words, "We could pull taffy," and the whole house changed, friends, the way weather changes. The sorghum went into the pot, molasses and a little sugar and a knob of butter and a spoon of vinegar, and it climbed to a boil while the children hung at the stove's elbow being warned back, and mother dripped a bead of it into a cup of cold well water, testing, until the drop clicked hard against the tin, and then out it poured onto the buttered platter, shining like dark glass, cooling till small fingers could stand it. And then the pulling, buttered hands, partners chosen, and the taffy stretched between them, hand over hand, and here was the marvel, the ropes turning before their eyes from near black to caramel to a gleaming golden cream as the pulling worked its magic, and their arms aching, and everybody laughing, because you cannot pull taffy solemn, it has never once been done. Snipped into pillows with buttered scissors, twisted into scraps of waxed paper, piled in a bowl, and eaten in the lamplight with cups of hot dandelion coffee while somebody wound the phonograph or opened the hymnal, and the wind, which had been the enemy all decade long, was just a sound now, outside, where it belonged. Nothing in this whole hour cost less than taffy night, friends, and nothing bought more, because the depression could take the wheat, and the dust could take the garden, but a kitchen full of butter-handed, laughing children was beyond the reach of both. That was the recipe, and love was the whole ingredient list. That's the pot that takes you back. That's the flavor that time forgot. And now, before we go, let us say the honest part plainly, because these families deserve the whole truth told about them. The Dust Bowl was not an adventure. Dust pneumonia filled country graveyards with children, and the mothers who fed everyone in this story sometimes buried their own no matter what they cooked or how they prayed. Farms that had taken 30 years to build blew away in 30 months. 250,000 people and more gave up ground they loved, and the ones who stayed worked like soldiers through a war the sky was waging, and when the rains finally came back at the end of the decade and the wheat stood green again, those people did a remarkable thing. They mostly hushed about it. They folded that decade away like a quilt too heavy for company, and they went on, and they fed the country through the war that came next, and they spoiled their grandchildren with sand plum jelly and never said what it once meant. You had to corner them at some golden anniversary, and even then, they would only allow, well, it was awful dry. We got by. Everybody helped everybody. That was the plains for you, friends. They did not call surviving the dirty 30s a triumph. They called it staying, and then they would ask if you wanted more pie, because feeding you was always the point. Thank you for keeping me company beside the old cook stove tonight, and for remembering these 25 suppers with me. Not one of them ever made a menu, hardly one of them ever made a cookbook, and the women who invented them signed nothing but the tablecloth. But they held the hungriest corner of America together through the hardest decade it ever endured. One covered dish, one jelly jar, one lamplit supper at a time, and remembering them out loud is the least we owe to the hands and the jars and the love that filled them. If this hour brought back a kitchen you had almost lost, a face, a smell, a wet sheet on a window, I hope you will subscribe and pull your chair up to our table regularly, because we have so many more suppers to remember together, and it is better remembering in company. And next time, we are moving ahead a few years to the ration book kitchens of the war, when the same women who beat the dust turned right around and cooked America through the fight of its life, with sugar stamps and victory gardens and cakes that managed without butter, without eggs, and somehow still tasted like hope. Until then, take good care of yourself, hold your memories close, and remember, here we remember the flavors that time forgot. We'll see you next time.